This is a place where two historic Irish communities have come into conflict with each other most dramatically.
The British Army was seen on the streets of Derry with guns at the ready.
And the worst example of that, of course, was out there on those streets, Bloody Sunday, where the British Army killed 14 people.
Derry was in a state of actual war.
This is London, being bombed again.
This is what the war in Vietnam is all about.
The liberation of Kuwait has begun.
All right, let's go!
The Troubles was how the decades of violence in Northern Ireland came to be known to the Irish themselves. To the rest of the world, the place name most linked with those troubles was probably Belfast, the capital city. But it's the province's second city, right here, that for much of the time was at ground zero of the conflict. It's been called a city of war, and more recently, a city of peace. And it's played its role at the heart of the Northern Irish story, not just in recent years, but right down through the centuries.
Derry, or Londonderry. Even the name is a matter of contention. For centuries, the city has been claimed and opposing labels applied by two sets of people. On the one hand, there are the original native Irish, the Catholics. On the other, there are the Protestants, who trace their ancestry back to the early days of a British colonial presence in Ireland.
You stop someone on the side of the road and ask them, how do you get to Derry? He will immediately know whether you're a Catholic or a Protestant. A Catholic will always refer to it by its old name as Derry, and the beleaguered nature of the Protestant culture comes out and says, no, this is Londonderry. So Derry is enormously symbolic. It's emblematic for both sides.
This powerful symbolism for both sides has deep roots. On the hills of the river valley where the city now stands, there was once repeatedly an oak grove, in the old Irish language, a dira. That became the name Derry. The oak grove became the site of an early Celtic Christian community of monks.
To the nationals, to Catholics, to people, if you like, who think of themselves as Irish, Derry is the ancient monastery of St. Columkill, the oak grove of the Druids, the great medieval settlement, one of the important places where medieval literature and manuscripts were made. To the Protestant population, the people who think themselves as British or Unionist, it's the city of Londonderry, the city, the colony founded by the companies of London in the early 17th century, the plantation of English order and civilization in this remote part of the world.
After the English colonists came over and added London to the name in 1613, royal charters were granted. One English king said early on that the settlement was fit to be made a town of war. Enormous walls were built, stone and earthwork defences at least 18 feet thick. Toward the end of the century, Ireland was caught up in the so-called War of Two Kings, in which the city's settlers owed their loyalty to the Protestant King William of Orange. They felt threatened by the Catholic King James, whose forces were sweeping through the countryside.
The Protestants, thinking they might be massacred by these oncoming Catholic soldiers, had shut themselves up in the city. The apprentices, in particular, led this. A group of apprentices slammed the gates shut in the city. The governor was intent on parleying, on possibly surrendering, doing a deal. But the apprentice boys took the law in their own hands and shut the gates in the face of King James's men. And that's why today you have an apprentice boys parade. They commemorate that down through the years.
Young men, barely out of their teens, said that they could not, in all conscience, yield up to what they would see as slavery, to domination, if they allowed the king to enter. So they said, no, we will not allow this to happen.
To today, the orange slogan is no surrender. They still call the city the Maiden City because it wasn't penetrated by the Catholic armies. And no surrender has a religious, a physical, a sexual, a political, you name it, resonance for the Orangemen.